So we found ourselves in a nasty war halfway around the world in a place called Vietnam. Every day, American journalists transmitted home the brutal details of that war. We read about the war in our newspapers and magazines and saw it in gory full color on our television sets. The living room war, someone called it.
The enemy has paid dearly, having lost.
The reporters who brought us the Vietnam story were men and women of indisputable courage and intelligence. But today, given the outcome of that war, given the trend in world affairs that our defeat in Vietnam may have helped shape, some important questions are surfacing. Was the coverage of the war fair and accurate? Did that coverage influence American policy properly or improperly? And what role should the press play in setting American policy? Good evening, I'm Ben Wattenberg. There is a wide range of opinion within the press corps about Vietnam. There are reporters who believe that the press never really understood the nature of that tragic conflict, and that Vietnam, in fact, was a war America lost on the nightly news and not on the battlefield. And there are many others who believe no such thing and think that the press coverage in Vietnam was not only accurate, but truly served the national interest. Tonight, we'll talk first to two reporters who covered the Vietnam War and who have problems with the coverage of it. One a European, another an American. Then we'll come back here where Mr. Neil Sheehan, a distinguished Vietnam reporter in his own right, will take issue with some of the ideas raised by his colleagues. In Europe, we talked to Mr. Yui Simonetto, a West German journalist who covered the war in Vietnam from 1964 to 1969 and again in 1972. As you look back on your own performance as a reporter, are you pleased with your recollections of the way you performed your job?
I'm not very happy with it. In the beginning, I was very pro-American. I became increasingly critical towards the end of my stint over there. And in fact, one of the reasons why I quit my job with my employers in Germany at the time was because they were more pro the war than I was.
Another guest is Mr. Peter Braestrup, author of a detailed study of American press coverage in Vietnam entitled The Big Story. Mr. Braestrup, when were you in Vietnam and covering it for what newspapers?
I was first in Vietnam from 1966 through 1967, the early part of the war, covering it for the New York Times. In 1968, just before the 1968 Tet Offensive, I became the bureau chief in Saigon for the Washington Post.
Where were you at the time of the Tet Offensive?
I was standing outside the wall of the United States Embassy. At that point, we believed that the embassy building had been occupied by the Viet Cong. We did not know that, in fact, in a fight during the darkness, pre-dawn darkness, the Marine Guards and the MPs inside the embassy compound had killed almost all the Viet Cong sappers. The wire services, the Associated Press and the United Press, had to keep filing minute by minute or 5-minute intervals. They kept running back and forth from the embassy to their offices, sending the latest bulletins back to the States.
Believing that the embassy had been captured.
Believing that the embassy had been captured, and often adding some imaginative detail about the fight, as United Press put it, along the carpeted hallways of the embassy. About mid-morning, General Westmoreland, who exuded confidence, came to the embassy and said the Viet Cong did not get in the embassy. He was saying this in the garden of the embassy while the dead Viet Cong sappers were being carried out by military police and stretcher bearers. Anybody could have gotten in the garden because there were hardly any guards, and they blew a hole in the wall and went in the garden. They just didn't do what they were supposed to do, and Hanoi claimed no victory. But the shock and the surprise of all this had its impact on the press.
They failed, but they won. Is that a metaphor for the whole Tet Offensive?
It's about as good a metaphor as you could find.
I was with the first column of American troops to relieve the MACV compound in Hue, and when we got into Hue, we saw all these people still festively dressed in for Tet, for the Vietnamese New Year, dead in the streets, and I mean, many of them quite obviously victims of assassination squads.
Didn't the press report this?
Yes, they did report it, but I mean, not as extensively as My Lai. I mean, they didn't dwell on it to the same extent, yet this was policy, My Lai was not.
The My Lai massacre was an aberration, an extreme case, an officer ordering his men to kill civilians in large numbers. The My Lai massacre would go down in history almost as a representation of American behavior in Vietnam, which was grossly unfair.
What was the nature of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong activity with civilian populations?
Well, they practiced, as a matter of tactics and strategy, what they called selective liquidation. Villagers every week, 100 or 200 villagers, teachers, cadres, government sympathizers would be assassinated or kidnapped.
If you look back on the Tet Offensive, what actually happened? Who won, who lost?
Historians, whether they were or are critical of the Johnson war policy or not, generally agree that Tet was a costly military and political setback for Hanoi in South Vietnam. By the time we left Vietnam in 1973, the Viet Cong, once touted as a kind of popular movement who had gotten the mandate of heaven to launch a people's revolution, was a relatively insignificant factor. The entire war was being fought by the North Vietnamese, coming in from the outside.
If the other side got beat during Tet, why didn't we get that sense from press reports?
Again, you have these problems of perception. If you're in the fighting area, that's where the destruction is occurring. You do not see the more tranquil areas, so you get a heightened sense, as you do in any disaster area, of destruction. TV news does not show, when it goes to cover a riot, the parts of the city that are not rioting. So you get the notion that the whole city is up in arms. Very few newsmen went back to take a second look after the initial round of attacks. Instead, they went to the next melodrama. That was Khe Sanh. TV networks in particular kept perpetrating the notion of impending military crisis through their focus on the siege of the Marine outpost, the only remaining melodrama, in northwest of South Vietnam, up in the corner near Laos.
How did the press treat the Vietnamese elections?
I think we didn't treat it fairly enough. If you consider the circumstances under which these elections were held, the country fighting for its survival, being under attack, the enemy at times at the outskirts of the capital city and inside the capital city, it was remarkable that these elections were held in the first place. This corruption angle worries me a great deal. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the corruption was rampant at the time in Vietnam, but people sort of emphasized this corruption, I think, too much at the time. Take the example of General Key. General Key was portrayed as a corrupt, flamboyant Air Force officer with a pretty popsy for a wife, enjoying fast cars and all this sort of thing, when in fact this guy lived very, very humbly in an army barracks at Tan Son Nhut Airport, and when, as we know nowadays, he did not put money aside to Switzerland, otherwise he wouldn't be running somebody else's liquor store in California.
Probably the most naive notion American correspondents had in Vietnam, as elsewhere overseas, is the kind of assumption that the worst sin a government can commit is to be corrupt, that is, to be venal. That if government officials are making money off contracts, off aid, that is the worst sin a government can commit. We did not discover that the South Vietnamese people, after considerable experience, had discovered there was something worse than corruption on the part of the government, namely a totalitarian, tightly controlled police state. We tended to portray the North Vietnamese as those wily little guys in the jungle who never made mistakes militarily, who in their daily assassinations and so on only assassinated people for clearly defined political effect. There was, certainly until '69, the general notion that the North Vietnamese appealed to genuine nationalist sentiment, that a sizable minority of South Vietnamese would vote for the communists.
You believe that was never the case?
I have no reason to believe it was the case based on the communist failure to recruit and sustain their guerrilla movement after Tet.
When the American government said that if we lost there would be a bloodbath, how did the press respond to that?
One ridiculed the domino theory, one ridiculed the bloodbath theory, yet the dominoes fell very quickly, not just in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere in Africa, and more are threatening to fall. And, of course, the bloodbath did happen. Look at Cambodia. Look at the way the Vietnamese drove their opponents into the sea. Look at Laos. I think, beyond ideological limits, liberals, moderates, conservatives should get together, editors, publishers, journalism schools, reporters, and try to avoid a repeat performance in the future. Basically, this is the first war in history that's ever been lost by one side via the media of the other side in the living room or bedrooms of the other side.
Neil, we've seen a film here that describes the representation of how Americans were told the war shaped up. My basic question is this: did we in America get a fair and accurate representation of the totality of that war?
I think if you add up the media coverage of the war over the span from '62 when it began really to the end, the news media gave about as accurate a picture of the war as it was possible for Americans to obtain, given all the mistakes and misrepresentations. A lot of the things you said about the news coverage of the war I don't think are true. The news media did not portray Ho Chi Minh as an agrarian reformer. We bought the bloodbath theory. Everyone agreed that there was going to be a bloodbath. In fact, there hasn't been.
What about there was a saltwater bath? I mean, there were all these people literally thrown into the sea. It was not a terribly pleasant experience. They were sent to reorientation camps. Many people have not returned from those camps.
people were put in re-education camps, and there probably are 50 to, oh, no one knows, perhaps 200,000 still there. But there have been no executions of prominent people for political purposes. The individuals, the people who were driven to sea that you're talking about were the Chinese refugees, the ethnic Chinese minority who were driven out of the country. They did not play a role in the war itself.
But they were regarded as opponents to the communist regime. I mean,
they were an ethnic minority who were victimized by Vietnamese, yes. And by that time, the communist authorities were in power in Saigon. But the fact that the Chinese were driven out to sea in a brutal fashion they were really didn't relate to the media coverage.
Well,
bloodbath.
The bloodbath theory also involved Cambodia and Laos, and surely we saw a bloodbath in Cambodia.
The Vietnamese weren't responsible.
No, I understand,
but
that was part of something else that was ridiculed. You say it was accepted, I gather, but the whole domino theory was something that, in the argot of the time, was generally accepted as, in fact, it was called the much discredited domino theory, as if that was one hyphenated long word, the much discredited domino theory, and yet that's, in fact, what we did see.
How many dominoes fell?
The only dominoes that LBJ and Rusk ever talked about were Laos and Cambodia, and they both fell.
Well, the dominoes they spoke about in their public addresses was all of Southeast Asia, all the way to Japan. In fact, that didn't happen. Vietnam.
No, they skipped a few squares and they ended up in Afghanistan and Angola and a lot of other places.
They certainly did. The theory was that if South Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia was going to collapse, and that just didn't happen. But to go back to the role of the media again, while I wouldn't agree with a number of the summaries you've given, I think the thesis, which Simon Netto sums up in the end, that the news media lost the war in Vietnam, is not a tenable thesis. In fact, I think it's silly. The news media in Vietnam were not that important in determining the outcome of the war.
Well, but the case...
They simply didn't play a key role.
Yeah.
They played an interesting and an important role, but they did not play a determining role.
I'm not saying, and I don't think Mr. Simonetto was saying, although I'll speak for myself, that there was any press conspiracy. I mean, these were obviously yourself and the other people out there were honorable, competent, intelligent, and patriotic men and women. The question, though, is that when you, just to take an example or so, if the idea of corruption, which is a not uncommon human governmental sin, is dwelled upon, again, one word, the corrupt Q-key regime. I remember that one, corrupt, 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 corrupt.
The fact is that corruption was a terribly important issue in the war. And the fact is that the Saigon government was immensely corrupt. And one of the reasons it lost the war, one of the major reasons for the collapse of the country in '75, was this corruption. The fact is that the other side was portrayed consistently as far more totalitarian and repressive than it was. The Vietnamese communists were supported by their own people. They managed to get hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese to die for them.
By that token, you would then say, I would assume, by extension, that we should not have, for example, defended the French in World War II because they didn't fight very effectively. I mean,
World War II and Vietnam are are two different wars.
But the proposition I'm suggesting is not different. I mean, you are saying that if your allies are ineffective, then we got no business defending them or helping them?
Well, I'm saying that you can't win a war with someone who's so weak that they can't fight and win, that they won't fight to win themselves. And you brought up the issue. You brought up the issue of corruption as the news media unfairly portrayed the Saigon government as being corrupt. Well, I don't think we did. In fact, the corruption was far worse than it was ever reported in the news media. There was a RAND study done a couple of years ago of interviews of Vietnamese generals, and they talked about the terrible role of corruption in the collapse of their own country.
No one would ever deny that there was corruption.
Just a moment. Right, when you're in a civil war, and one side is not corrupt, as the communists were, there was some corruption on the communist side, but it was quite limited. And you're engaged in a fight with an opponent who's intelligent, who's able to appeal to his own population, who's got a national movement going on his side. And your government is so corrupt, I'm talking about the Saigon regime now, that you're selling heroin to your own army, which is what they were doing after they couldn't sell heroin to our people. When you're selling off the medicines so that you can't treat your own wounded. When your helicopters don't fly because people are using them for smuggling and flogging off the parts. When finally you're put under pressure as they were in 75, and the whole thing collapsed in 75. They didn't fight in 75. The whole thing collapsed. And corruption played a major role in the collapse. Corruption is a real problem.
I'm concerned about that description of corruption in South Vietnam, not because I'm in any position to deny it, but because it tends to ignore, in a very different sense, and this is where I think much of the problem is, the profoundly corrupt, in the true sense of the word, nature of a communist, totalitarian, repressive government. We complained, one aspect of our problem with Vietnam, I recall quite dramatically, was, they put some South Vietnamese editors in jail because they were critical of the government. In North Vietnam, do we have to even get into that discussion that there was no press freedom, no freedom of mobility, no freedom of trade unions? This was a profoundly a police state.
It turns out that the Vietnamese communists were able to marshal enough support among their own people to get them repeatedly, year after year, to die and to defeat the United States of America, which was a major undertaking. And they were able to do it. If you take a look at the role of the press in this thing, I think you've got to put the press in perspective against the other elements that went into both us going to war in Vietnam and us losing the war in Vietnam. First of all, let's just take a look at the role of the press in general. I think if you take a look at the television coverage, which I have looked at from 65 on, you'll see that the news media in the beginning hastened our entry into the war. They facilitated it.
That's right.
Walter Cronkite sounds, until Tet 68, like a Pentagon spokesman. What changed it in terms of general news media coverage was the Tet 68 setback, which was a political victory, political and psychological victory for the other side. Now, having spent 25,000 American lives, about $75 billion, and having told the country that all of this sacrifice was to a good and useful end, that we were now bringing this war to a conclusion, and then having people wake up one morning and pick up their newspaper, and I remember looking at the headline on that newspaper when it said, Viet Cong in U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. It's just a tremendous psychological shock.
But suppose that's exactly the point.
And it broke the will of the American people to continue to prosecute that war in a conventional
Suppose that headline had quite properly read, and I use this metaphorically, but that specific headline had quite properly read, Viet Cong foiled in embassy takeover.
Okay, let's say it had read. Let's say it had read.
And that would be a metaphor for the entire Tet
Right.
experience.
Okay, let's say that, well, they weren't foiled at the embassy. They got into the compound, they managed to make a shambles of the place, and they got on television. And it was one of the few...
sappers didn't go in order just to get into the garden and get killed, did they?
They went into that compound to get in there and get as much attention as they could and get as far as they could. There were very few purely American targets selected during the Tet Offensive. Most of the attacks were against Vietnamese installations. The American embassy was picked deliberately for psychological reasons.
You are making my case that they really waged this war as a war in the living rooms of the United States, as a press war. I mean, that's
it wasn't just in the living rooms of the United States.
Right.
What in the name of God were they doing in the middle of Saigon in the U.S. Embassy compound? You can't hide the truth for very long. You could have hidden it perhaps for 6 months.
You talked about tactics on this thing. This perhaps gets a little far afield, but if tactics, as you look back on that tragic time, if tactics could have been arrived at, that war would not have ended in defeat for the United States and would have ended in the survival of a South Vietnamese non-communist state. If such tactics could have been arrived at, would that have been a worthwhile enterprise for us to pursue?
No, I don't think so. Looking back on it, we didn't have any basic national interest in Vietnam. The men who led the American military and political institutions at the time could not conceive of fighting the war in any other way. And those tactics of sending young men up the same ridge to die time and time again until you finally destroy your own army, and which is what they did. by 69 and 70, the U.S. Army was hardly a fighting force in Vietnam in terms of its morale, etc. You can't ask men to conceive of more than they know, and these things have a predetermination about them. And I think Vietnam was one of those cases.
We could probably argue that one for at least another hour. But Neil Sheehan, thank you very much for being with us this evening. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Ben Wattenberg. Please join us again.